Wow. Amen. Thank you, choir. Thank you, choir that was behind me as well as in front of me. It was pleasing to the Lord. We're going to see today just how true it is that our work and our worth is in him and through him, and just how much that will do to our walk if we just focus on him for our work as well as our worth. If you turn to Romans chapter 9, and we will be starting today in verse 30. We're going to look today at what you might call the tyranny of the self-made identity, where we don't find our worth in him. The tyranny of the self-made identity, as I've titled this sermon, otherwise known as works righteousness, where you feel like who you are stands or falls on your works, on what you do, on your grades if you're younger, or on being good at sports if you're younger, or on your position in the church, or on saying the right things, or getting the right people to like you, or on climbing the corporate ladder. And if truth be told, you even think you have to impress God because your acceptance, and we all struggle with this, is based on your performance. We're going to see today that the self-made identity is really a tyranny compared to the liberty that comes when the indwelling Spirit of the living Christ brings your work to life and your worth to life. As the Spirit of the living God falls fresh on you, to which we can only say, as we'll sing and as we sang, breathe on me, breath of God. You're all that I need. Fill me with life anew. Bottom line of what it takes to be a successful Christian. It's in Romans 9, and we'll be starting today in verse 30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, but he who believes in him will not be disappointed. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer for them is for their salvation. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness. The Jews that Paul's talking about here remind me of something that I experienced with my sister way back in the day. They remind me of the Pregoni statues. Pregoni is Italian for prisoners. The prisoners that my sister and I saw back in 1976 when we took a year out of college to bicycle and camp through Europe together. And then we spent some time in Asia with my folks who were missionaries in Singapore. But back in Europe, one of the countries that we enjoyed the most was Italy. And of all the places in Italy that we most enjoyed was a place that you enjoyed as well, and that is Florence. We really fell in love with that city, this jewel of a town with this incredible cathedral that rises up in the morning mist like this dream. It was in Florence, Italy, in the gallery of the Academy, that we saw Michelangelo's famous statue of David, which he finished, believe it or not, when he was 26 years old. It's one of the greatest sculptures ever created. It takes your breath away. It epitomized the secular humanism of his day, with the heroic scale of David, with his almost superhuman beauty and power, the swelling, volume of his form, his vibrant pent-up energy that somehow Michelangelo captured in stone. It's like he's looking off into the future with tremendous virility and prowess and pride. Interestingly, his hands and feet and head are much larger proportionately than they should be given the size of the body. And that's intentional because it gives you the feeling that with this big head and hands and feet, man can go anywhere and do anything. It's the self-made man of the Renaissance. But I think what's most telling is his face. If you look carefully at David's eyes, you'll see something else that's obvious once you notice it. And that is that they're deeply disturbed. It's like they're haunted, and his brow is furrowed. It's wrinkled. It's worried. It's like dark and pensive and wondering as he looks off into the future that he's responsible for. You sense the burden of the self-made man because it's all up to him. You can't go into the room, though, where David is without going through a long hallway first. A hallway that's lined with the pregoni, Italian for prisoners. The pregoni statues, as they're called. These are the ones that for some reason Michelangelo just left incomplete. One of them has a head that's nothing but this block of stone, with these crude legs, and his arms are pushing up against this massive marble that encases his head as though he's trying to break free but can't. There's another block with the front half of the figure kind of carved out and showing, but the back half is still in the stone. And it's like he's straining, he's stretching, he's striving to get out of the stone, but he can't. It's a whole gallery of tortured figures trying to break free. All of them leading up to the figure that has made it, so to speak, the great statue of David, who himself has this haunted look. Today we're going to be looking at the self-made man, and at half-made men and women who'd like to be self-made but don't have what it takes to fulfill that desperate desire. We're going to be looking today at each and every one of us at one time or another. At the tyranny, the impossibility of works righteousness, trying to win acceptance by laboring on your own to turn yourself into something that someone wants you to be, or into what God wants you to be, or into what you think you ought to be. Such people either soar, with pride if they end up looking like David, or they'll crash with despair if they end up in like the pregoni. Because only God can bring your work and your worth to life. Doesn't matter how long or how hard you labor, only he can do it. To which we can only say, as we'll sing, as we'll see, and as we sang, breathe. Breathe on me, breath of God. Fill me with life anew. That's all I need. Again, Romans 9, let's unpack it a bit, starting in verse 30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were, by works. You might say, putting it in context, that the Gentiles were the pregoni, the prisoners of that day. And then something happened and they came to life. The Jews, on the other hand, were the spiritual Davids of their day, but they stayed hard as stone. To put it in context, we're moving today from Israel's separation to our inclusion. From the question of how God could reject his own chosen people, if it's really true that nothing can separate us from his love. We move from God's rejection of the Jews to his acceptance of the Gentiles, which is rejection of the Jews made possible in his mercy. Because as we've seen, Paul's out to prove that God is not tyrannically sovereign, but mercifully sovereign, even in hardening people. We move to the inclusion of the Gentiles that came thanks to Israel's separation. Paul begins by telling us why Israel was accepted and why was rejected and why we were accepted. We've already seen that just because they were born Jews doesn't mean that they were true Jews. And so God was rejecting those who weren't really Israelites in the first place. That was at the beginning of chapter 9. And now at the end of the chapter, he tells us what it took to be a spiritual Jew, a true child of God, and how it was that in God's mercy, the Gentiles became children in their place. Again, verse 30, and this time I'll read it from the New Living Translation, so just sit back and listen. What then shall we say about these things? Just this: the Gentiles have been made right by God, with God by faith, even though they were not seeking him. But the Jews who tried so hard to get right with God by keeping the law never succeeded. Why not? Because they were trying to get right with God by keeping the law and being good, instead of by depending on faith in Christ for everything. And in so doing, they became hardened by pride that they became so hardened by pride that they were crushed by the stumbling stone, but that came rolling in, and that was Christ. He had to break them. Just as it is written, verse 33, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in his work, though, will not be disappointed. As you will be disappointed if you live by faith in your own work. Paul goes on to show us first the motivation of works righteousness, and he leads up to it starting again in verse 1 of chapter 10. Brethren, my heart's desire and my prayer for them is their salvation. For I bear witness with them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with true knowledge. Rather, it was a zeal that was in accordance with ignorance and pride. Verse 3, for not knowing God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. And then we come to the heart of it. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes, not do's and don'ts. The word end here in the Greek means that Christ is two things. He's the goal of the law, and he's how we get to the goal. He's the very picture of it. He's the very picture, the masterpiece of the masterpiece that we're supposed to become and that we can become. And he's the very power by which we become that. The end of the law. Because when even him, he breathes on us. And his Spirit comes into us. Just like he breathed on the disciples in John 18 as a sign of what would happen after his resurrection, when he came by his Spirit to live in them and to fulfill his law through them. For the Jews, it was external. For us, it's supposed to be internal. They were hammering away from the outside in to attain to this external pattern, subjecting themselves to the righteousness of the law. But no matter how good they ended up looking, they were still hard as rock and cold as stone. Their hearts hadn't been transformed. Whitewashed tombs, as Christ said, tombs in the form of dead men, like David. We, on the other hand, are to subject ourselves to the righteousness of God. And to do that, we do that by faith as we let him work from the inside out. As we look to his person and rely on his work, he becomes our righteousness. He's the end of the law. And when we do, when we come to him as the living stone, as Peter said, we also, presto changeo, become living stones. No longer dead. Unlike the Jews, in verse 31, this time in the New Living Translation, who tried hard to get right with God by keeping the law, but they never succeeded. Why not? Because they were trying to get right with God by keeping the law and being good instead of by just depending on faith in Christ. And you do that by turning to him and calling on him. Just like when you were saved. We're sanctified just like we're saved, as we'll see in chapter 10. You turn to him and you just pray, help me, Lord. You say things like F.R. Havergal did. I like to pray this at the beginning of the day sometimes. It's a little poem. He said, live out your life within me, O Jesus, King of Kings. Be yourself the answer to all my questionings. Live out your life within me, and all things have your way. I, the transparent medium, your glory to display. We can't do that, but we can pray that he'd do it, and he will. The temple, I am the temple, has been yielded and has turned from sin. Let your Shekinah glory now flash forth from within. And all the earth keeps silent. This body henceforth be your humble, docile servant, moved only as by thee. My members every moment held subject to your call, ready to have you use them or not be used at all, held without restless longing or strain or stress or fret, or chafing at your dealings or thoughts of vain regret. And then he concludes, may I be restful, calm, and pliant, from bend or bias free, permitting you to settle where you have use of me, and there live out your life within me. O Jesus, King of Kings. Different saints put it in different ways as they apply this. To pursue righteousness by faith and not works is to do what Lilas Trotter did. She was a great missionary to North Africa 100 years ago or so. It's a classic she wrote called A Blossom in the Desert. It's a book of wonderful devotional meditations, and I love this one. It's called Sails to the Wind. She wrote, I am seeing more and more that we begin to learn what it is to walk by faith when we learn to spread out all that is against us, all our physical weakness, loss of mental power, spiritual inability, all that is against us inwardly and outwardly, when we learn to spread out all that is against us as sails to the wind, and expect them to be vehicles for the power of Christ to rest on us. It is so simple and self-evident, but so long in the learning. The righteousness, the acceptance, the fullness that comes by faith, not works, as we spread ourselves out as sails to the wind. Breathe on me, breath of God. Move me like you want me to be moved. To pursue him by faith is to turn to him and say that. Breathe on me. We're going to cycle back to this again when we look at the simplicity of faith righteousness later on in chapter 10. And we'll see just how this happens. And we'll look again at how practically to do it because it's so important. But for now, this week, to tee it up, Paul does something first. And to want to do it and to keep doing this, we need to be inoculated against doing it all on our own by remembering the tyranny of works righteousness. Beginning again with putting to death the motivation of works righteousness, back to verse 3. For not knowing God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. It says, seeking to establish a righteousness of their own. The motivation of works righteousness is pride. The pride of the self-made man or woman who's accomplished something of his own and on his own, and who postures and poses for all the world to see, which is precisely the Pharisees' problem. That's right. It's why Christ said to them, how can you believe if you receive glory from one another? John 5:44. That is, how can you subject yourselves in your emptiness to God's righteousness? How can you look to his acceptance when you're so enslaved to man's acceptance? How can you subject yourselves to God's doing anything through you when you're so subjected to the praise and the approval that comes through what you're doing on your own or trying to do on your own? Wesley Nelson, another devotional writer, put it this way. Listen carefully. There would be nothing offensive about a way that would permit us to see ourselves as becoming better and better Christians, achieving greater and greater success in devotion, morals, and service and witnessing. This would be quite challenging and satisfying to human nature. Such a way of achievement, however, contains the seeds of sinfulness within itself, for it still revolves around ourselves. God is still left in the periphery of life to be used as a lever to help self achieve what it desires. Since such a way does not make it possible to honor God as God, it cannot break the power of sin. Even in the Christian, man's sinfulness and not honoring God as God often persists in the form of assuming some credit for what seems to be a superior devotion. When we serve God faithfully and devoutly and feel we are more acceptable to God than someone else, we show an attitude of pride in works that can nullify the grace relationship. And without that grace relationship, without that faith relationship where it's all from him and through him and to him, even the Christian can become cold as stone. The motivation of works righteousness is a kind of pride that for the sake of the glory of man will not submit itself in all abject dependence to the righteousness of God, with sails to the wind. Why? While seeking to establish their own righteousness, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Which brings us to the last verse for today, one which takes us from the motivation of accomplishment, to what it leads to, and that is the desperation of our imprisonment, which you'll find in a single verse, the next verse, our last for today, verse 5. For Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on the law shall live by that righteousness. This is a curse. The Message version puts it this way: anyone who insists on using the law code to live right before God soon discovers it's not so easy. Every detail of life regulated by fine print. And was that true of the Jews or what? For them, living by the law meant, to begin with, living by strict obedience to the 681 provisions of the Old Testament law code. And then literally tens of thousands of traditions that grew out of that. There were over 500 laws, for instance, based on the single command to rest on the Sabbath so that you'd really do it. It's almost a curse, a judgment, as in, okay, I'll give you what you've chosen. If you choose a standard of perfection on your own, you shall live under the tyranny of that standard. That's the implication of this verse. The righteousness based on law uses external measures exclusively, looking at the specifications, you might say, for the sculpture, for David. We strive to attain to conformity, and that ends up being a tyranny. Rather than looking to the master, which is liberty and true glory. Verses 4 and 5 go together, and they ask the question, what are you going to live by? By some law or by Christ, who's the end of the law? In the law, you've got the specifications for the masterpiece, but the problem is that you can't live by that law because you're not the master. And so you'll never attain to conformity. But Christ is the masterpiece and the master, and he's the masterpiece who is in you to turn you into a masterpiece too, as by faith you simply turn to him like sails to the wind, and you attain more and more to glory. Paul's talking about an impossible standard of righteousness, because with works righteousness, with performance-based acceptance, nothing you do is ever enough. Pride is never satisfied, and insecurity and inferiority are like bottomless pits, and nothing and no one can ever fill those. And for them it became a grievous burden imposed by the scribes and the Pharisees, as Christ said, who tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders. And what a picture that created. When Christ looked out over Israel, he saw people under the yoke of the law, living under a tyranny of this external standard of perfection, the righteousness of the law. He saw all these spiritual, Davids posturing and posing in the temple and on the corners of the streets as they prayed, full of themselves. And he saw the poor prisoners that you passed by to get to the temple with heavy loads on their shoulders, with, blocks for heads and half-formed bodies who couldn't possibly attain to the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees because they had to make a living. And in any case, they were all dead too. And I can't help but think that that's what many churches look like as well, who fall back into works righteousness. To the Davids of his day and of our day, he'd say, "Woe to you, hypocrites, whitewashed tombs." And to the prisoners of his day and our day, he'd say, "O pregoni, I have come to set the prisoners free. Come unto me, all you who labor and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Just come to me and call on me. It's easy, if you're anything like me, to fall back into works righteousness, working to win God's acceptance by your own laboring, by laboring to turn yourself into what he wants, by self-efforts, and it's all up to you. Or working to win the acceptance of others as though they were God, by laboring to turn yourself into what they want. Or working to turn yourself into God, whether by, climbing the corporate ladder or winning popularity at school or by having it all in the bank or by having it all in the head theologically, or through clothes or cars or developing a beautiful body or degrees or promotions or your own successful business. Such self-effort so easily, so subtly breaks the faith relationship, the grace relationship. And it so easily becomes a yoke of slavery that begins with pride and ends in imprisonment. Under a tyranny of a standard that won't let you go and a spell that you can't break unless you come to him with a broken heart and say, "Breathe on me, breath of God. Fill me with life anew. I'm dead without you." Michelangelo was under that spell of works righteousness. He was a proud man. I'd probably be proud if I were him. I'm proud and I'm just me. And so he was a tormented man. His goal was to create an immortal statue. He was haunted by this desire to free a living form from the stone. He knew he couldn't do it, but he couldn't stop trying, which is the classic double bind of pride. You got to do it, but you can't do it. We saw this too back in 1976. My sister and I also went to Rome, where we visited St. Peter's Basilica. This is where you can see Michelangelo's statue of Moses, which is universally acclaimed as his greatest work. Of course, the artist wasn't satisfied with it, and so when it was done, he looked it over, and in a fit of rage, he struck the stone and said, "Why don't you speak?" To this day, there's a long, narrow gouge on the knee of his greatest masterpiece. Why don't you speak? Pursuing a law of righteousness, they did not arrive at that law. And how do you arrive at it? Well, how do you avoid the haunted look of Michelangelo's David? Because it's all up to you, who had the whole world on his shoulders. Well, we'll continue with this, as I said, but for today, the bottom line is this. Before you do anything by way of obedience or performance, just come to him and call on him as the fundamental pattern of your Christian walk. all through the day. Come to him in your desperation and call unto him for your transformation as you spread your sails to the wind. Do it all through the day, and incrementally but inexorably, you'll attain to glory. Not your glory, but his. Let me close with this. I'll never forget the scene at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Many, if not most of you, have probably read it. At the beginning of the story, the White Witch, who represents Satan, had turned all these poor creatures into statues. You might call it the spell of works righteousness, the same spell that Satan casts on us. Aslan represents Christ, of course, and he had finally come back to Narnia to set things right. And he comes to the courtyard of the witch's castle, and he does something with these statues that lets us see suddenly what's happening with us incrementally as we turn to him. It happens to us in slow motion as we come to him in our desperation and look to him for our transformation, as we spread our sails to the wind. It happens so slowly that it's so easy to think that nothing's happening. But one day when we are in a glory, when we're in our glory, looking back on the whole sweep of our story, we're going to see what the children did in the castle that was filled with, you might say, pregoni. So here it is in fast motion, in time, a kind of time-lapsed photography, you might say, from the beginning to the end of our story, as more and more we're transformed into his glory. This second to last chapter is titled, What Happened to the Statues? What an extraordinary place, cried Lucy. All those stone animals and people too. It's like a museum. Hush, said Susan. Aslan's doing something. He was indeed. He had bounded up to the stone lion and he breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked around, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with the stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment, Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." A tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him like a flame licks all over a bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane and all the heavy stone folds rippled into living hair. Then he opened his great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn. And now his hind legs had come to life as well. He lifted one of them and scratched himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him and frisking round him, whimpering with delight and jumping up to lick his face. Of course, the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful they soon forgot about him. Everywhere, the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum. It looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing round him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors: glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs, and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarves. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Now," said Aslan, "for the inside of the house. Look alive, everyone, upstairs and downstairs and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed. All it took was his breath of life. And that's all it takes for us. But it's got to be our choice. He won't force himself on us. So we need to come to him, turn to him, and call on him. As the worship leaders come forward, for this to happen, we need to do that, to come to him in our desperation and call on him for our transformation as we spread our sails to the wind.